The claims made by one of the loudest gun lobby groups, all their claims about hunting rifles being banned, all the models that they showcase in their memes, videos, and posters, all the other models that you've seen on social media and in videos, etc. This has likely led to the withdrawal of these amendments.
The firearms that were banned, or at least on that list, were, it was the majority of the guns. People say it wasn't, but if you know firearms, and I hear a lot of people talking here that don't know a lot about firearms. Honestly,
that just because a gun is used by some for hunting, that does not make it a hunting firearm.
Do you have recommendations to make in terms of how to distinguish between war weapons, weapons of war, and hunting weapons? Well, Benabdallah, before you comes from a mosque. Benabdallah is talking about a tragedy, and Benabdallah is telling you we don't want that tragedy to happen again. Benabdallah is not a technician in this matter. I do not want there to be weapons of war circulating.
Statistics Canada came out very interesting back in December 2021, firearm violence. 0.47% of violent crimes had a rifle or a shotgun present. 0.47% present. Not necessarily used, but present. So we're talking about a very small amount. Out of that, a significant amount of those were gang-related. So when we're talking about legal firearm owners and the legislation that we're bringing forward here today, we are talking about a fraction of 0.5% of total violent crimes in this country. And we're missing the whole boat on 99% of crimes in this country. Thank you.
With Amendments G4 and G46, Canada was never so close to a complete and permanent banning of assault weapons.
There is a distinction between the right to hunt and the right to hunt with an assault weapon.
I keep hearing weapon. I don't have a weapon. That's a subjective opinion. I don't have a weapon, but I keep hearing that I have these weapons. I don't. I keep hearing that they're firearms for military purposes. My classic English double rifle, break action, 2 bullets in, close it up, shoot it, Turkish walnut engraved, it's worth $90,000. It's on this list. It's going to be prohibited. It's like that. It's never been used in any type of a crime, and certainly not in any military application.
The misperception that some people have, including the witness who was with us today, we are not targeting all semi-automatic weapons, but rather the semi-automatics that are military. They have military characteristics. Their initial velocity is highly powerful, which goes beyond any normal citizen use.
Communities, is the life of a conservation officer more or less on par with the life of a hunter or a guide or anybody else working in these dangerous situations, and they should have access to the same type of stopping power that a conservation officer would, because conservation officers can't be everywhere.
All lives are equal.
Obligatory compulsory buyback, the promise for a permanent prohibition, as well as regulatory tightening for large capacity magazines.
While we are open to the possibility that the proposed amendments may have included legitimate hunting rifles, we have not seen any evidence of this as of yet.
We are not doing an emotional analysis because we were injured at the Polytechnique. We are analyzing a proposal that has scientific bases.
You have a PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology. You received your MD from Queen's University. You received your specialty of emergency medicine at McMaster. You were also a fellow at the Royal College of Physicians in Canada. You are currently an ER doctor at St. Joseph's. You are also assistant clinical professor of medicine at McMaster University and the director of clinical teaching unit. And you are certainly one of the foremost experts in Canada on the issue of gun violence in terms of homicide, domestic homicide, and mass homicide, and the impact, if any, of various governments' gun control legislation. I've reviewed your papers, and it would seem that the gun control measures brought forward in the last number of years by this government and other governments have had no impact on homicide, domestic homicide, or mass homicide. Can you confirm that?
That's correct.
And again, your research is heavily peer-reviewed, and you've also been asked yourself by various medical journals to review other research papers in a similar field. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You have found no statistical significant beneficial association between firearms legislation and homicide by firearm, as well as spousal homicide by firearm, and as well as the criminal charge of discharge of firearm with intent. Is that correct?
That's correct, in this country. What the legislation seems to do is, for the most part, it seems to target legal firearms owners with a variety of legislation and restrictions. And you're targeting a group of people that are rarely involved in criminal behavior.
Everybody understands that hunters are not a threat to your safety and not to the national security of this country. And yet we feel vilified and marginalized. Recently we feel attacked. We're not the enemy. We love our country.
Your best target would be trying to reduce demand in the criminal area, trying to reduce the movement of young, usually male youths into gang behavior, and trying to deal with some of the proliferation of street drugs that have occurred in this country. We're at a dangerous level in terms of methamphetamines now. This is what I see in the emergency department all the time. And all I hear is we're targeting a bunch of hunters. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Serious flaws to this C-21, and I recognize and I appreciate that the previous speakers have said there's some untruths in this, and we're not the problem here.
And it seems like we have our blinders on almost to what's going on around us.
The taking a way of life is a terrible, terrible thing. Obviously wrong, fundamentally wrong. But the taking of a way of life is also wrong.
Maybe we've gone too far.
Welcome to meeting number 57 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Duncan. Sorry. I've been to Duncan. No. Anyway, Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. We will start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of November 25th, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. So pursuant to Standing Order 108 Sub 2 and the motion adopted by the committee on Friday, February 3rd, 2023, the committee is commenced its study of the effects of the withdrawn amendments G4 and G46 to Bill C-21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments firearms. Today we have 2 panels of witnesses. We'll just, of course, delve into the first one right now. In the first hour, we have the Centre culturel islamique de Québec, et Polysesouvient. Also, we have, as an individual, Mr. Jim Shockey, who's a guide and outfitter. Each witness group has 5 minutes for statement. And I understand that Centre culturel islamique and Polysesouvient will share their time, so you'll have between the group of you 10 minutes, and I'll let you allocate that as you please, and we'll drop the hammer at 10 minutes, okay? So we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Mr. Shockey later. So go ahead, please, 10 minutes.
Bonjour.
Good afternoon. Chair, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Public Safety Committee. First of all, I would like to mention that we have with us today representation from the Polytechnique community, Mr. Serge Centeno, and myself. I represent the Muslim community of Quebec Mosque. Here we are again before you. It's important to hold these consultations, we agree, because the debate on banning assault weapons, let's not kid ourselves, seems to have gone awry amidst purely political issues, instead of focusing on the importance of eliminating weapons of war from our society. And I have chosen my words correctly. Weapons of war is what they are. Let us remember, Chair, and it's very important to remember, that only 2 months ago, for people who experienced the Polytechnique who are here in Montreal now, and barely 2 weeks ago for people who were affected by the Quebec Mosque massacre that I am representing here, we were commemorating 20 people who lost their lives, 14 young women who could have been expert engineers today and do good for us, working for bridges, aviation, and all sorts of things, and 6 fathers who could have expressed the joy and experience the joy of sending their children peacefully off to school. 20 people died, and what of all the injured and the survivors with whom we share the pain, the suffering, and the broken hearts in the face of the inhuman firing of these arms? It's been over 3 decades since the victims of these mass killings committed with this type of weapon have been fighting to have them banned. 33 years in the case of the Polytechnique, 16 for Dawson, 6 for the mosque. And I am embarrassed that 33 years of struggling has not been enough for us to come to an agreement. All we are fighting for is to have these weapons not circulate so that we don't see this same pain and suffering from the Polytechnique. 16 years for Dawson, 6 years for the mosque. And despite the fact that our efforts are supported by the vast majority of Canadians, I'm sure they don't want these weapons. But yet we have to come to Parliament yet again to tell you about the importance of banning these assault weapons. It is deplorable for victims such as ourselves and for ordinary citizens who wonder why these weapons were not outlawed immediately following the massacres. New Zealand and Australia are an example. They were able to prohibit them right after the Christchurch and Port Arthur tragedies. And yet Canada is located right next to a country who shall remain nameless and who shows the disastrous impacts of easy access to weapons and assault weapons, more specifically. In 2020, 647 mass killings took place with weapons in the United States. These included assault weapons. That's nearly 2 killings a day. Do we want that to be what we experience here in Canada? Of course not. School children and teachers are assassinated in their schools. People are killed in houses of prayer, houses of worship, other people in their workplaces. I am saying this because I have to shake us up. We're not here trying to defend a lobby. We're not lobbyists. We are people who are shouting from the depths of our heart, we don't want these weapons on our streets. We don't want to see our children killed, our workers killed. We respect hunters. We respect other people. And my friends here beside me will give us more details. This is what we want to avoid for Canada, for our children, and for a future, a better future. If every political party could contribute, I'm sure that we would have the joy of being able to see this bill passed. It's our only opportunity to prohibit assault weapons for the good of all. Please, do what it takes. Let us all do what it takes to make this happen. That's all I wanted to say. It's coming straight from the heart. And I hope that you will help us to achieve these results. I'd like to give the rest of my time to my colleagues from Polysesouvient, Nathalie and Heidi Rathjen. Thank you. Thank you, sir. So there are another 6 minutes left. Hello. In 1991 and 1995, the Conservative and Liberal governments respectively banned a list of assault weapons. But because there was no comprehensive and permanent definition in the Act, new models of assault weapons progressively invaded the Canadian market. Please understand me. Without a definition in the law, manufacturers will continue to introduce new models, and we will slip backwards, and it'll be much easier under any government which would not share the same values for public safety. For us, the goal is permanence. We cannot having to go through this yet again. Since 2050, the Liberal government was elected 3 times with a promise to ban assault weapons. The Bloc and the NDP shared this commitment, but progress has been slow. And only now, in its 3rd mandate, is the government trying to deliver on its promise. With Amendments G4 and G46, Canada was never so close to a complete and permanent banning of assault weapons. Let's not forget that this measure was the central demand of the Polytechnique students and the families of the victims and has been so since January of 1990. Heidi and I were there. We were at the first press conference where we formulated this demand. And that is why we supported the global government strategy announced in May 2022, because it involved obligatory compulsory buyback, the promise for a permanent prohibition, as well as regulatory tightening for large capacity magazines. We count on the support of the Bloc Québécois since 1990, and we understand today that the leader of the NDP supported our demands. Please, in committee, we are asking you to work on meeting the demands of Canadians to prohibit assault weapons, to break down the withdrawn amendments so that Canadians can understand their true nature and their impacts. On a solid scientific and rational basis, fact-based, that's where we should have new, clear, and improved amendments. We want them to be adopted. It is important.
Our hope today is that these special consultations will first and foremost seek to clarify the true impacts of Amendments G4 and G46, since any new amendments should be based on real and legitimate concerns. While we are open to the possibility that the proposed amendments may have included legitimate hunting rifles, we have not seen any evidence of this as of yet. On the contrary, a detailed analysis of the claims made by one of the loudest gun lobby groups, an analysis which has been validated by the RCMP, shows that all their claims about hunting rifles being banned are either false or misleading. Indeed, all the models that they showcased in their memes, videos, and posters, only one would be affected by an amended C-21, the SKS, which is clearly a military weapon, and it was exempted from the 2020 Orders in Council because it was not of modern design. For all the other models that you've seen on social media and in videos, etc., their classification would not change. That's because G46 incorporated the 2020 OICs, Orders in Council, including variants for greater clarity, meaning models whose military caliber versions have been prohibited for 3 years, almost 3 years now, and whose hunting caliber versions continue to be used for hunting and will remain legal and non-restricted. Government experts have testified before this committee to that effect, and as I said, our assessment has been validated by the RCMP. We believe that such widespread misinformation has provoked massive and unfounded fear amongst hunters, who then inundated members of Parliament with emails, calls, and letters, and this has likely led to the withdrawal of these amendments. I hope this committee will seek to debunk this disinformation to the benefit of all. That being said, we recognize that a key challenge is a lack of clarity surrounding these amendments. The legislative proposals were particularly difficult to understand. Many believe that the fact that that if a model is listed in G46, that means that all versions would be prohibited, even though government officials have testified to the contrary. We therefore fully support reviewing the language in both amendments to make it simpler and easier to understand. We also remain convinced that the intent of the amendments was not to prohibit firearms reasonably used for hunting. We have publicly supported the idea of exempting specific models if some fell on the wrong side of that line. However, it should be noted that just because a gun is used by some for hunting, that does not make it a hunting firearm. Case in point, the gun lobby considers the AR-15 and even handguns firearms fit for hunting. That is why the expression reasonably used is key and why it also exists in the criminal code. We recognize that specific issues related to Indigenous people's hunting rights must be addressed.
Could you wrap it up, please? At
the same time, it should be noted that there is a distinction between the right to hunt and the right to hunt with an assault weapon. Yet in that spirit, we were not opposed to the exemptions for Indigenous subsistence hunters that are part of the 2020 Orders in Council, and we would accept similar exemptions in the case of a comprehensive and permanent ban on assault weapons. In conclusion, our last point, we continue to support the proposed evergreen definition in G4. However, because of the importance of ensuring that manufacturers do not circumvent the intent of a ban on military-style semi-automatic weapons, we respectfully request that the committee look into ways to adjust the evergreen definition in a way that minimizes such potential circumventions. Thank you.
Thank you. And in my haste to get started, I'm remiss in failing to introduce you as individuals. So with the Centre Culturel Islamique de Quebec, we have Mr. Benabdallah, spokesman. From Polysesouvient, we have Heidi Rathjen, coordinator, and Nathalie Provost, spokesperson as well. Sorry for that oversight. And we will carry on now with Mr. Shockey. Please go ahead. 5 minutes.
Hi, I was introduced as a guide outfitter, but in fact, I'm a hunter. And just to give you an idea of where I sit in the hunting world, I was given the Professional Hunter of the Year award in 2009, given the International Hunter of the Year and the World Conservation and Hunting Award in 2012, Conklin Award in 2016 for the highest standards in ethical and fair chase, 2018, the OFAH Award for fair chase and total integrity, 2018, the winner of the Weatherby Award, only the second Canadian in 70 years to be given that award. So I'm a hunter. I've also produced over 500 episodes of outdoor television and worked closely with the First Nations and the Inuit communities in the North. I've written over 1,000 articles in outdoor publications. And on a personal note, I've been married for 38 years to my soulmate and have 2 children and 4 grandchildren. And most importantly for this committee, I have a great and growing concern for the public safety of my family here in Canada and my fellow Canadians. But speaking as a hunter, I want to make it clear to this committee that although I live the field to table lifestyle and people like me live this lifestyle where we go into the field, we hunt what we eat, we're not your enemy. Hunters are not the enemy in this case, and our firearms are not a threat to the security of Canada and safety of Canadians. So I'll address some of these C-21 issues that concern us as hunters. Semi-automatic rifles, are they popular? Yes, they are. They're commonly used for hunting many different species of animals in many different conditions. Just to get a hunting license, hunters have to they have to pass tests. They're vetted. They're the best at knowing what's the proper firearm to use. I don't use weapon because that's not what these are. I don't think they qualify as weapons in the Canadian Criminal Code. You can confirm that. But and semi-automatic rifles are commonly used. Shotguns are commonly used. Most outfitting that I look after takes place in remote communities, mostly Indigenous First Nations, Inuit territories, and the economic benefits of the hunters that come in, mostly from the States, and often they use their semi-automatic firearms. If this goes through C-21, my fear is that you're going to see a boycott from down south, which will be have a catastrophic effect on these communities, remote communities that require this input of foreign dollars, American dollars, into those communities. And by the way, the meat from the animals taken in these communities goes to those communities, to the elders. My Rogue River outfitting territory, we donate several tons of meat to the elders that can't go hunting, and we provide them with the traditional pieces of the animals, the nose, the caul fat, pieces that they don't get and rely on. And I, the dangerous animals, another reason, semi-automatic guns are the best defense. I think the Yukon government actually AR-10s, or I think that's what they're called. I'm a hunter, not a gun guy, but I think they selected those for their conservation officers after studies that proved that they were the best to use, and they are in dangerous situations. So again, I don't want to take a pile of your time here. I'm a hunter, and I'm obviously out of place with all of you here. Those are not elephant tusks on that side, by the way. Those are woolly mammoth tusks. But I want to say that you mentioned respect for hunters, and I think that's really important that everybody understands that hunters are not a threat to your safety and not to the national security of this country. And yet we feel vilified and marginalized. Recently, we feel attacked. We're not the enemy. We're love our country, and the taking of life, the taking away of life is a terrible, terrible thing. Obviously wrong, fundamentally wrong. But the taking of a way of life is also wrong. And I just back to the respect for hunters. I'm here because I would like the respect, and I'm speaking for hunters across Canada. We just feel like we've been turned into criminals with this, and I think there's some serious flaws to this C-21, and I recognize and I appreciate what the previous speakers have said, but there's some untruths in this, and like I say, as speaking as a hunter, and for the hunting community, what you saw when you tried to pass the amendments.
Can you wrap up, sir?
We're fearful, and we're not the problem here.
Thank you. So we'll start our questioning with, we'll go through our first round with Madame Dancho.
Thank you, Mr.
6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here. Thank you, Mr. Shockey, for being online. Just like to say, I appreciate the honesty, and I feel that everyone is speaking from their heart, and I appreciate the very raw sentiments that are being brought forward. And I think I can speak certainly for our team that we are looking to have a very respectful dialogue and consultation today and in the coming meetings. So I very much appreciate the tone put forward by all of you to start this consultation process today. Mr. Shockey, I have a few questions for you to start off. You mentioned the economic impact of hunting in the north. Now, I'm not overly familiar. I'm not from the north. I'm from rural Manitoba. But my understanding is a large part of the Indigenous diet in northern Canada, particularly where your outfitter is, in the tens of thousands of pounds of meat that they are provided, are in fact from the American hunters that your outfitter guides. Is that correct?
Yeah, and what the Americans do for us up in the north, in the remote communities, is a very positive thing. And the one fellow mentioned a name he doesn't want to mention, but I'll mention it. Americans coming up there, spending their dollars, economic benefits are huge in the communities, and for the vast majority of the Americans that come up, they donate the meat to the elders in those communities. And in my case, in the Rogue River Outfitting Territory, in the Yukon, the Mayo band, the elders receive the meat, and as I said earlier, not just the meat as we know meat, steaks and whatnot. They get the caul fat, the kidneys, the diaphragm, the nose, all these pieces that we, the American hunters, donate to the elders, and it allows them to maintain their traditional lifestyles, even though they're too old.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I appreciate that information. I think it's a very important part. There was no economic assessment done with the amendments, and I think that this is an important part if there should be an impact from any ban like this that goes forward, to recognize what that might be and how to mitigate it. And how many, sir, would you say, what is the percentage of American hunters that your outfitter provides? I know there's thousands of outfitters. I know very well that the outfitters, for example, in rural northern Manitoba are greatly benefited by American hunters, and certainly when the border was closed for COVID, they took a huge hit, as did the Indigenous guides that they employ. So what if you can give me a ballpark percentage of what is the percentage of American hunters that you have, would you say?
97%, ballparking it, certainly over 95%.
Okay. So if, as you mentioned, and I have been hearing this from others, but that in the event that this ban moves forward, we may see a complete decline or drop-off of American hunters coming up to Canada. And I just want to confirm, in your opening remarks, you mentioned that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I know most of the American players, and if they got on the bandwagon to boycott Canada as a hunting destination, I think it would be catastrophic to the industry and to the northern community.
Thank you. And I know, of course, Canadian hunters, many of my family members engage in northern outfitters as well. I do want to talk, you mentioned semi-automatics, and I shared with you previously the specific definition of those that were looking to be banned by G4. How common would you say that those are? You mentioned in your opening remarks, but just to reiterate.
Yeah, they're common, and it's a personal choice of each hunter. You put 10 hunters together, there'll be 10 different opinions on what is the proper firearm for a given situation. As an outfitter for the last 30 years, I've seen many semi-automatics come up.
Certainly, and that's not just popular with Americans, but also Canadians. Is that correct?
100%
okay.
True.
I also want to speak to, you work a lot with Indigenous hunters in particular, and I do think this is a very important piece as well, because we've heard from the Inuit community that there is the issue of polar bears and protection against wild animals. Why would a semi-automatic of the definition in G4, why would that be, or would that be the best tool available in Canada currently should a northern individual come across a polar bear, for example? Like, can you explain that for the community? Can you break that down?
Yeah, it is the choice. And it's the choice in Africa of professional hunters going after dangerous game. For the average hunter as well, it's the ability to there's no such thing as overkill in a situation when your life's in danger. And so in the Inuit communities, they'll even take the trigger guard off their firearms so that they can, in cold weather, hit the trigger with their mitt. And you can't work a bolt. I mean, it's cold. Semi-automatic, to me, would be the choice that I would recommend if I was asked as a professional. And as I said, consider to be one of the top hunters in the world.
Right. And of course, I know that you're a very gifted hunter and you're a very good shot, but not all hunters are necessarily capable of taking out a predator that is coming at them with one. So just my understanding is, given the structure of a semi-automatic long gun, particularly a rifle, it just ensures the best case scenario for you in the event you come across a polar bear. I think you've come across 2 situations or 3 situations where you were under attack by a cougar as well as 2 bear encounters. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I wouldn't be speaking here right now if I hadn't reacted properly in all 3 situations.
Well, thank you very much for sharing this information. I'm just out of time, but I appreciate you providing some understanding to the committee regarding the realities of Northern Canada and the benefits, certainly the economic benefits to Indigenous communities and to the outfitter industry in Canada as well. So thank you very much, Mr. Shockey.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Ms. Dancho. We'll go now to Mr. Noormohamed. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Je veux juste commencer par vous remercier pour être...
I'd like to begin by thanking you for being here with us today. Very clearly, your experiences and the tragedy that you have described and that you have experienced continues for you. And this is very important for us to take into consideration in our deliberations. And I'd like to thank you for being here with us, because I know that it is impossible for us to understand the depths of the difficulties and sadness that this experience that you have to relive each time that you come here is.
Really thanking you for sharing with us and putting the time in to be here with us on what I know can only be extremely difficult. I have said this many times, and we've heard this. The intention of this law was not to take away Indigenous people's rights to hunt. It was not to adversely impact hunters and farmers. And one of the things I think that's very important for us to talk about at the outset is how do we ensure that in that conversation we are not losing the memory of victims, and we are not moving forward in a way that does not address the need to ensure that there are no more massacres like at the mosque in Quebec City, that there are no more École Polytechnique massacres. So we have to figure out how to achieve this together, and I'm so grateful that that's the approach that we're all taking today. So perhaps I can ask Heidi, Ms. Rathjen, maybe you and I have spoken about this before, maybe you can share with us how do we best think about the issue of the rights of Indigenous peoples and making sure that whatever legislation comes forward continues to afford them their right to hunt and does not make this unnecessarily difficult for them.
So for sure, the Indigenous question needs to be addressed. We've been favorable to exemptions or special considerations for Aboriginal people in the past, even under the Firearms Act that was adopted in the 90s. We did not oppose the exemptions for subsistence hunters, Indigenous subsistence hunters, to keep using the prohibited firearms under the May 2020 OICs. And we've communicated this in different ways to the government, to opposition parties, that we wouldn't oppose the same type of exemption for this new list, these new 482 models of assault weapons, as long as it's a well-conscribed process. And that these weapons are grandfathered, and that it's not like a blanket exemption where they can keep buying new assault weapons. It's to keep those that they have, and it, in that circumstance, we'd be open to it.
Thank you, Mr. Benabdallah. We just commemorated a couple of weeks ago the 6-year anniversary of the massacre of 6 people at the mosque in Quebec City. As you mentioned, not a couple of months ago, we remembered the women killed at École Polytechnique. And I'm always struck by the fact that in both of those circumstances, a legal firearm owned by a so-called lawful gun owner was responsible for both of those massacres. And so I guess the question that I would ask you, Mr. Benabdallah, is many years after École Polytechnique, for someone to have obtained a gun legally, a legal gun, to come in to the mosque and to do that, to commit that type of an act, what message did that send to you, and what message has that left with the community?
C'est un message de mémoire qui n'arrête pas de nous.
A memory that haunts us year after year. The killer who went to the mosque came with an arsenal of several handguns and an assault weapon. When the assault weapon was used up, he turned to his handguns. And the handguns had 48 bullets, 6 deaths. One person is still in a wheelchair. He got 6 bullets in the neck. And the 7th bullet is still causing problems. If this assault weapon worked, there would have been a minimum of 50 deaths because everybody was at the back. And he did it intentionally. He threw it down and he took his handguns. So this keeps coming up to people who were there, who went through it, our friends. People saying, imagine if that assault weapon had worked. What would have happened then? None of us would be here to be able to commemorate any of this. We would also be in coffins, buried underground. We want people to remember this. Do we want things to continue like this? Do we want to be like in the U.S.? No, we're not against hunters. We've said this. We're not against Indigenous peoples. We've said this. Hunters, you're an inveterate hunter. You have a lot of experience. And never in anything that we said did we say that we were against hunters. So don't slander us by saying that. It's as though we who have gone through the consequences are against hunters. What sense would this make for the population? We were never against hunters. We were never against the Indigenous peoples. Apologies, sir. That's all the time you have. Now, Madame Michaud, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. It's most appreciated to be here yet again, despite the fact that you have come before. It's very important to legislate on weapons, handguns, assault weapons. And if you're here again, it's because I proposed to my colleagues at the committee to hear witnesses again following the amendments tabled by the government regarding assault weapons. What we understand is that the committee was not necessarily moving forward after the tabling of these amendments because everything was being changed. As you know, the initial bill was focused mainly on handguns. The government brought in these amendments in November, whereas the bill was tabled in May, and there were substantial amendments dealing with assault weapons. And you are in favor of a prohibition of assault weapons. The Bloc is also in favor of this. We've said it many times. But we came to some sort of an impasse, and that's why we proposed hearing other witnesses. And in the meantime, the government withdrew its amendments, saying that it had not listened to the affected groups and in the population enough, and that's the reason the government gave for withdrawing the amendments a few days ago. Now, I understand that when the bill was tabled, it was mediatized, and the government seemed to have made promises to groups that it was going to prohibit assault weapons in this bill. So that left about 5 months to produce something well thought out, and unfortunately, this is not necessarily what we saw. So the fact that the amendments were withdrawn today, well, let me ask the people from Polysesouvient first, and then Mr. Benabdallah after. Do you see this as a broken promise, the fact that the government has promised that they were going to move forward with banning assault weapons, and they have been withdrawing these amendments? From what we understand, and the same day that the amendments were withdrawn, the government, I think Mr. Trudeau and the minister at the very least, undertook to try again. So we understand that the way in which it was done was problematic. This is not our purview in terms of how the process goes, but that the will is still there, and the willingness to work with both parties who during the last 3 elections promised and committed to supporting and passing legislation prohibiting assault weapons. So no, the will is still there. We see that there is work being done, and we're counting on the committee to see why these were withdrawn. And I think it is largely because of disinformation that frightened hunters. That's everything that we've been hearing, that the bill went too far, but it's really based on things that certain MPs and groups were saying. But we can see this when we ourselves were able to analyze and have the RCMP validate the fact that all of the statements regarding the hunting weapons that would have been forbidden by the amendments, all of that is actually false. The classification of all hunting weapons which were presented by those opposed to the amendments, that their classification wouldn't change. So we see that the amendments were not properly understood, and now it's time to step back and look at how it is that they were misunderstood, and to reintroduce them and improve them if necessary. Clearly, they need to be clarified, especially G46. Because hunters were seeing a list of models of weapons, and they saw their weapon included in the list, so they thought that all versions of that model would be prohibited. And that's not true. Only the models with certain calibers we're talking about the 10,000 joules, so we're talking about military caliber that could be classified as military vehicles. So for comparison, an AK-47 has its initial energy 2,000. And the amendments wanted a limit, not just the amendments, but it's a criteria that exists now, wanted a limitation of 10,000. So we're not talking about hunting weapons here. But unfortunately, because it's 309 pages and, people didn't quite understand that only the military caliber versions were targeted. And that's in terms of the current bylaw or law so that military versions are prohibited, hunting versions are allowed, and this doesn't change. These are the weapons that were mentioned in their campaigns. So, if I may, we need to have a definition. It's necessary and fundamental so that any law passed can be evergreen. Since 1990, there were lists upon lists upon lists, but the market is vast. Innovations by companies is endless. So if we don't have a clear definition, we're going to be chasing our tails yet again. And after 33 years, how is it that we're still here with a legitimate demand recognized by most Canadians? So I hope that the Liberals will retable a new amendment, and I hope that it is going to be examined prima facie by facts, because here we are not doing an emotional analysis because we were injured at the Polytechnique. We are analyzing a proposal that has scientific bases. Thank you, ladies.
Please, 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et merci à notre...
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to our witnesses. Thank you for being here, and Mr. Shockey as well. Mr. Shockey. Ms. Provost, Ms. Rathjen, I was a student at Sherbrooke University when the misogynistic massacre occurred, and this is completely stamped in my memory. So thank you for being here. And Mr. Benabdallah, we commemorated the Islamophobic massacre at the Islamic Center a few weeks ago here on Parliament Hill. And this is also something that I will never forget. So you talked about war and hunting weapons. This is my first committee meeting on this committee. I'm new. So these issues of definitions are very important. So I apologize in advance if you've already answered this question. But do you have recommendations to make in terms of how to distinguish between war weapons, weapons of war, and hunting weapons? Well, Benabdallah, before you, comes from a mosque. Benabdallah is talking about a tragedy, and Benabdallah is telling you we don't want that tragedy to happen again. Benabdallah is not a technician in this matter. If you ask a forestry question, you know, I can arm wrestle with you on that one. But when it comes to weapons, they have 33 years of experience, Mr. Julian, 33 years. And they have deemed it useful today to say if you have to redefine things so that they can be more clear and accurate and speak to everybody, well, they're here, and I stand with them. I'm sorry for avoiding the response, but I'm not a technician. My colleagues are technicians. I do not want there to be weapons of war circulating, because there was a weapon of war, and had it worked, there would have been at least 45 to 50 other deaths in our mosque. I don't wish that on anybody. Thank you. You are most eloquent. In this case, I would move to Ms. Provost. But you raised the issue of manufacturers who use loopholes now. Now we know that often Polysesouvient has had to tell the government about new models coming in, and manufacturers found a way to get around the existing list. And Polysesouvient are the ones who had to inform the RCMP. There is something off with that. Do you have any recommendations to make in terms of the responsibilities of manufacturers and the process that currently exists? If there's a definition, the manufacturers would not be able to lie about what they're proposing to Canadians. Today, there's just a list. So they put a new weapon on the market. They register it on and make it sellable in Canada by the description. And they explain if it's going to meet the characteristics of a restricted or non-restricted weapon. If we have a definition, then we cut off that strategy Now, maybe the list that would accompany the definition will be imperfect and would have to be readjusted, because a list is never going to be 100% complete and perfect. But at least we'll be able to exempt things because they're less dangerous. But now you have to run after danger, because there's always somebody adding something more risky, more powerful, that we don't want to recognize in Canada, but we have to chase the sellers. I think we have to be more severe, and we should be able to exempt where we've gone too far. I'd be much more reassured as a Canadian. Ms. Rathjen, do you want to answer both questions? You asked what a definition would be. I can't go into detail, but essentially we're talking about weapons that can shoot, semi-automatic weapons, and to correct the misperception that some people have, including the witness who was with us today. We are not targeting all semi-automatic weapons, but rather the semi-automatics that are military. They are designed with magazines of more than 5 bullets and are not used for hunting. They have military characteristics. Their initial velocity is highly powerful, which goes beyond any normal citizen use. And in terms of the permanent definition, as Nathalie was explaining, we need a permanent definition to capture the new models that could come onto market after the fact. At the same time, we think it's important to have a list, because an evergreen definition cannot encompass every assault weapon. There are assault weapons that have different mechanisms and that can only be captured in a case-by-case analysis that looks at the characteristics that are military. So in the 2020 criteria of the Ordering Council, they added, it wasn't a regulatory definition, but it was a description which gave the intention of the framers of the legislation. And they talk about military weapons that were not for citizen use. So we need both.
That brings our first round to a close. We'll start our second round. The second round is going to have to be abbreviated. We will have to end this with Mr. Julian at the end of the day. But we go now to Mr. Calkins, please, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses that are here today. It is a very, very important discussion that we're having. I'll ask questions of Mr. Shockey. I too am a hunter, Mr. Chair. I have appeared in, or have produced 0 television shows. I have not near the success that in the hunting world that our guest and witness here, Mr. Shockey, has had. I would be the individual that watches Mr. Shockey's shows. And I want to thank you for coming here and testifying today to the impact that it has. I have been a guide in the north, and I have been a conservation officer and a national park warden. I have been issued firearms as a matter of my duties in that capacity. And Mr. Shockey, you did allude to this in your opening statement that the Yukon, where Rogue River Outfitters is located, the Liberal government of the Yukon implemented for their conservation officers the AR-10. An AR-10 is a .308 caliber semi-automatic rifle for their conservation officers. They did this actually after the Order in Council in May of 2020, which moved the AR-10 from the non-restricted to the prohibited category. And the Yukon Liberal government at the time said that this was the best option available for the protection of their conservation officers in dealing with wildlife, human-wildlife conflict and interactions, and to protect the general public in a situation from dangerous wildlife. So I guess my question to you, Mr. Shockey, given the fact that you've hired numerous Indigenous guides as part of your operation, you've worked with folks in those communities, is the life of a conservation officer more or less on par with the life of a hunter or a guide or anybody else working in these dangerous situations, and they should have access to the same type of stopping power that a conservation officer would, because conservation officers can't be everywhere?
All lives are equal.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the answer, Mr. Chair. Could you repeat that, Mr. Shockey?
All lives are equal.
Very much. Now, you said in your opening remarks that that there's a significant impact on the Indigenous communities should the tone, and I believe, could you give us an indication of what the tone is right now this debate and this discussion is creating in the hunting community? And your fear is that the tone would actually keep the vast number of guests who come from out of country to northern Canada, and what the economic impact would be. Who are the communities and what are the job opportunities in these northern remote communities if lodges and outfitters that offer hunting opportunities lose a significant portion of their clientele because of the confusion that's being caused by this debate?
The first part of your question, what's the feeling or the sense that hunters, we feel fear that we're being attacked, as I said earlier, vilified, marginalized. We feel that we're not respected, and there's a measure of distrust. I keep hearing weapon. I don't have a weapon. That's a subjective opinion based on every situation that a firearm's used. I don't have a weapon, but I keep hearing that I have these weapons. I don't. I keep hearing that they're firearms for military purposes. My classic English double rifle, break action, 2 bullets in, close it up, shoot it, Turkish walnut engraved, it's worth $90,000. It's on this list. It's going to be prohibited. It's like it's never been used in any type of a crime, and certainly not in any military application. So this is where I, as a hunter, I hear this and I'm listening, and I appreciate the emotions involved. I mean, it's a terrible, terrible tragedy, and that can never be understated. On the other hand, like I said earlier, a way of life is also important to many people, especially us. I feel like from the Hunger Games, I'm from District 12 and I'm a tribute, and you guys are the capital. You don't understand us, and the communities in the north. If there's a ban, or if there's a protest against coming to Canada, a boycott, it would be catastrophic. I mean, where does the money come to these communities from? Tourism? That's not realistic. It doesn't happen in most remote communities. Most of the money that comes into the communities from outside sources is from hunting and outfitting. The jobs are there. Our television show on the Aboriginal People's Television Network, Yukon Harvest, it's all First Nations people and Métis. So like I say, that a boycott would be catastrophic, and that's just the passing of C-21. I'm not getting into the individual amendments and whatnot. You cannot underestimate the effect and the lives that it would cost. They're already struggling in these communities, and to throw this on top of it, it's well-intentioned, but I have a feeling that there's going to be unintended consequences because of it.
Thank you, Mr. Shockey. Thank you, Mr. Calkins. On y va maintenant, Madame.
And now over to Madame Bendayan. 5 minutes, please. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. Mr. Benabdallah, it's a pleasure to see you again, and thank you for your warm welcome at the Quebec Mosque 2 weeks ago during the commemoration. Ms. Rathjen and Ms. Provost, good afternoon. Since the beginning of the meeting, you've raised this in your introduction from Polysesouvient. We've been talking about the fact that several parties have undertaken to prohibit assault weapons in the past. It's a pleasure to hear Mr. Julian and the excellent questions that he asked on the committee, and of course Ms. Michaud. I have a lot of hope. I'm a fighter, but I'm also somebody who thinks that we can change the world. I was pleased and actually quite relieved to hear the leader of the NDP, Mr. Jagmeet Singh, earlier today say in an interview just outside the House and say that he was open to amendments to be able to achieve the objective of prohibiting assault weapons with a definition. In particular, I thought it was important that Mr. Singh said, and I'm going to quote him in essence, that he is open to finding ways of having amendments which will truly protect the community and meet the needs and concerns of organizations such as Polysesouvient. So, ladies, I would like to ask you, what message would you send to the three progressive parties that you mentioned and that you said that they have this intention, this conviction? And why is time of the essence? Why do we need to do this in the form of amendments to Bill C-21? Tabling legislation, analyzing it, studying it, it's a lengthy process and it's a fastidious process. If at this very moment we can't take advantage of the momentum of Bill C-21, we have been at this table before you too many times. We know full well that the process is so long. If we lose out on the possibility of having a definition this time, we don't know when we'll be able to get another chance and whether there will be the political will to do it. So for us, it is essential that today all parties who believe that there must be a prohibition on assault-style weapons in Canada get to work. The other thing is that I find it essential that we base ourselves on facts, data, and an objective analysis of an amendment. It has to be a solid amendment. My grandfather is a hunter. My uncles are hunters. I am not from the rural milieu, but I come from a rural milieu, and I recognize the importance of hunting for many Canadians. And I recognize also the importance of hunting for the First Nations and Indigenous communities of Canada. It's part of our history. It's part of what we are based on. It's our foundations. So never, with a capital N, would Polysesouvient ask for a halt to hunting or the prohibition of all weapons. Never. But what we want is that a means be found to clearly define what is an assault weapon with criteria, solid science-based criteria, so that that type of weapon cannot be in the hands of Canadians. There is clearly a way of doing this rationally and not based on emotions so that hunters will be able to feel respected in their practice, but which means that all Canadians who want to live in a country in safety will have a law dealing with firearms that respects this need for security and safety, which is a fundamental need. Thank you very much, Ms. Provost. I think misinformation is a big factor in this issue, and I'd like to recognize and thank Polysesouvient for the work that you are doing, both on social networks and with the media, so as to clarify this and to answer questions being asked by Canadians. With the time I have, I'd like to turn the time over to my colleague, Pam Damoff.
20 seconds.
I know. All of our witnesses for being here today. I just want to clarify something that Mr. Shockey mentioned. If the amendments had been passed, there would have been 19,000 models with over 100,000 variations of firearms available. My understanding is there's 20 million AR-15s in the United States. They've been restricted since '77 and banned since 2020 in Canada. So the doom and gloom for the industry seems quite misplaced. And I just want to say guns commonly used for hunting are very different than trophy hunting in Africa to bring trophies for your trophy wall or bringing Americans to the north to get trophies for their trophy wall. So I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Shockey, if you wish to respond, go ahead.
Yeah,
Chair, it wasn't a question.
Oh.
My time
I
is up.
think in fairness, he should get to respond.
Yeah, I think that's an untruth. The firearms that they use in Africa and the firearms we use here are virtually the same. There's no distinction, and it's not trophy. It's about hunting. It's the process, the journey, not a kill. So trophy hunting is a little bit of a derogatory comment when it's used like that.
Thank you. On y va maintenant, Madame Michaud, Madame.
Over to Madame Michaud. You have 2.5 minutes, please. Thank you, Chair. I'd like to get back to what my colleague Ms. Bendayan just said, and I'd like to thank her for her words. And to be frank, if she wants the NDP or the Bloc to support what the government is going to present, the government has to present something. For now, we're taking 4 sessions to hear witnesses again. That doesn't leave the government very much time to remodel anything. I have a fear, even if our intention is the same, which is to prohibit assault weapons. And I'm sure you remember when you came to testify the first time, I said, if the government doesn't keep its promise, the Bloc Québécois is going to table an amendment to prohibit assault weapons. And when I consulted our legal advisor, she said it would be inadmissible because it goes beyond the scope of the project. This bill is dealing with handguns. So it would be very surprising for the chair to move forward with that. Ultimately, the chair did go forward. My amendment was rejected, but there was a Liberal amendment. So I believe that behind the fact that the government withdrew its amendments, there's a fear that the chair and that the Speaker of the House will decide that the amendments were inadmissible. So that fear is there. In this case, how would you propose for us to function? In other words, should the government propose something different in a separate bill aside from C-21? Should it be done directly within this one? You were talking about definitions. I agree that we need a good definition that includes weapons before, during, and after. It shouldn't be list-based, and the list that we had in the Orders in Council showed that there were holes and this wasn't enough. We have to have a definition that includes all weapons, including the weapons of the future. So I'm wondering what you propose and what you think the government should do now, given that we only have a few weeks before the clause-by-clause review happens. Well, we are not experts in parliamentary procedure, of course. So I cannot really tell you what would be admissible or not. But one thing's for sure. We believe that the government has to consult and closely collaborate with the 2 opposition parties who support this, the Bloc and the NDP. We would encourage the government to work with you so that the amendments that will be retabled can be approved by all parties in favor of the prohibition of assault weapons. So just to repeat, from our point of view, from the outside, there are major steps back. What we see is that there have been 3 elections and 3 parties have been promising to prohibit assault weapons. So to talk about procedures and technicalities, that's not our area. We are citizens who have experienced mass killings. And we are carrying the message of 80% of Canadians who want to prohibit these weapons. And we are asking you to do what it takes to bring this objective about. There must be special procedures, but we're not familiar with them. That's up to the committee and the government to find them. But clearly, ultimately, at the end of the day, we are asking and hoping to see a bill pass that includes an evergreen definition and an evergreen, complete, comprehensive banning of assault weapons. Thank you.
2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. You delivered a very clear message today, but what Ms. Michaud just said is very important. The government should have referred this to committee before second reading. The fact that that wasn't done means that these amendments were not admissible, and that's the problem, or one of the problems that we're looking at. But that's something that we have to examine, not you. And we will do so, and we'll try to see the best possible way. We have understood your message today. It's very clear.
A question for you, and I apologize if this is something you've already answered. I believe you've appeared before the committee before. I'm the new guy on the block, so I will ask this question even if you've answered it. You mentioned your estimate was 97% of Americans as clients of outfitters. I wasn't sure whether you were talking about your business or in a broader sense, regional businesses. Can you quantify what you feel would be the impacts on these two amendments and what that would have meant in terms of either your business or the impact on outfitters generally?
I didn't hear that you were speaking to me, but I assume that because I'm the expert in those areas that you asked me.
Yes, I was directing it to you. Yep.
Right. The amendments were, from what I understood, and again, I'm a hunter. I'm not a gun guy, and I'm certainly not a politician. The firearms that were banned, or at least on that list, were, I mean, it was the majority of the guns. People say it wasn't, but if you know firearms, and I hear a lot of people talking here that don't know a lot about firearms. Honestly, they know that the firearms caused great pain, and that's as I said before, a terrible tragedy. But the firearms are that were on the amendments. That's why I'm here.
Yes, no, I apologize. I've only got a few seconds left. I just wanted to know if you could quantify. You talked about 97%, but you hadn't quantified what you believe to be the impacts, and I just wanted to know if you had figures you could share with the committee.
Well, for instance, in my opening territory in the Yukon, we probably a gross revenue of 1.2 million, and from what I understand of the studies that have been done, and these are polls, so I don't know if they're scientific peer-reviewed studies, but outfitters in British Columbia years ago were being attacked as well, and they found that the multiplier effect was about 25 times what the revenue from each outfitting operation. There's 217 outfitting operations in BC, 19 up in the Yukon, so you could probably use that study, I would imagine. I mean, I'm not a pollster. And as I said, I'm not a politician, I'm a hunter. But
thank you, Mr.
I can
Julian.
tell you from my side as an outfitter, it would be catastrophic, and that would be for the community as well.
Thank you, Mr. Shockey, as well. So that brings this panel to a close. I'd like to thank you all for your time here today and your testimony. It is all enormously helpful. It will help us in our work, and I appreciate you being here and sharing with us your expertise and your perspectives. With that, we will suspend. Thank you all, and we will bring a new panel. Thank you all. But today on this panel, we have Mr. Mark Ryckman, Manager of Policy for the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. And by video conference, we have, as an individual, Dr. Caillin Langmann, Assistant Clinical Professor, Department of Medicine, McMaster University. Welcome, gentlemen. When we commence, you will have each of you up to 5 minutes for an opening statement. And we will start with Mr. Ryckman, please. 5 minutes, if you please.
Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. On behalf of the OFAH, thank you for the invitation to appear at this committee. The OFAH is the largest nonprofit, conservation-based fish and wildlife organization in Ontario, with 100,000 members, supporters, and subscribers, and 725 member clubs, with 55 of those clubs operating 122 CFO-approved licensed ranges. Our organization is 95 years old, so we have a long history of advocating for the hunting community in Ontario. While there are provisions in Bill C-21 that we have concerns about, I will keep my comments scoped to the impact of Amendments G4 and G46 on the hunting community. Hunting is an ancient tradition passed down through generations and remains a way of life for many Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. Hunting today makes important social, cultural, and economic contributions to our country. It remains an important way to put food on the table, connect to nature, create and foster relationships, relax in the outdoors, and contribute to the conservation movement. Indeed, some take offense when hunting is referred to as a sport or hobby, because it is so much more than that. Hunting isn't just for rural Canadians. Hunters come from urban, suburban, and rural Canada. They are judges, lawyers, teachers, dentists, plumbers, mechanics, even politicians. Hunting provides information and funding for wildlife management, can help control populations and address human-wildlife conflict, and can foster a sense of obligation to give back to nature with conservation activities. In 2018, hunting spending totaled $5.9 billion, and the resulting contribution to Canada's GDP was $4.1 billion. Hunting supported 33,000 jobs and generated almost $2 billion in labor income. The importance of our hunting heritage is even recognized in federal legislation. There is no such thing as a hunting firearm type. Firearms primarily used for hunting are also frequently used for plinking, shooting at the range, or even competition. There are no hardline thresholds for labeling firearms as hunting or non-hunting, particularly when only looking at the appearance or overall design of the firearm itself. It requires comprehensive examination of multiple features and functions of a firearm, like the action and caliber, but will also be influenced by non-firearm considerations like the cartridge, the user, environment, target species, and jurisdiction. We are pleased that the amendments have been withdrawn and applaud this committee for studying their impact. In addition to the nature of the amendments, we were also troubled by their unexpected introduction and the lack of consultation. In proposing Amendment G4, the government jumped directly to prohibitions, skipping over less extreme alternatives that would have helped achieve its goal without infringement on hunters and other legal gun owners. A stepwise and adaptive approach creates better policy and is much fairer for Canadians than the unnecessarily blunt prohibition of guns by make and model. Take detachable magazines as an example. The Criminal Code already prohibits the possession of any magazine that holds more than 5 shots for a semi-automatic centerfire long gun. If it can hold more than 5 rounds, it must be pinned so that it can't. Bill C-21 proposes to go further and make unpinning a specific offense, as opposed to a lesser-included offense. So we have a proposed new offense that hasn't even been enacted yet, let alone been given a chance to work, when the amendments were introduced. Even if the government felt compelled to go further, they could take targeted measures, like banning import and sale of new magazines that have the potential to exceed 5 rounds. Our opposition to the amendments is not partisan or emotional or predetermined on principle. It was only after a thorough critical analysis that we arrived at this conclusion. It won't enhance public safety. The evidence simply doesn't support it. Firearms are not the disease, particularly in a nation like Canada with robust gun laws. Gun violence is often symptomatic of much bigger societal issues. Taking firearms away from law-abiding Canadians will not reduce the upstream issues that fuel criminal activity and the demand for illicit firearms. Therefore, model-based firearm prohibitions will continue to fail, as they won't be able to have a detectable impact on reducing gun violence or enhancing public safety. If political discourse remains fixated on finding the firearms that should be banned or saved, then we will continue to underinvest in the resources and time we need to address critical issues that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ryckman. We go now to Dr. Langmann. Doctor, go ahead, please. 5 minutes.
Thank you for letting me present my research regarding Canadian firearms legislation and its association with homicide, spousal homicide, mass homicide, and suicide in Canada. I'm assistant clinical professor in medicine and emergency physician in Ontario. I serve as an academic peer reviewer in the areas of firearm control, homicide, suicide, violence, and gang deterrence for academic journals, and have 4 peer-reviewed publications on legislation and the effects of homicide and suicide in Canada. In 2022, I presented and submitted my studies and a report regarding C-21 to the committee. The research demonstrated previous bans in the 1990s of a large number of handguns had no effect on homicide rates. Currently, a definition of assault rifles and subsequent bans has been proposed. My research on previous Canadian legislation is applicable in answering the question of what the effects of this legislation may be. Since 2003, the number of owned restricted firearms has doubled from 572,000 to 1.2 million. However, the rate of overall firearms homicide has not increased, nor has the rate of homicide by handguns. There's been recent fluctuations similar to the levels in the early 2000s, but the rate of homicide has actually fluctuated about a steady mean when statistical analysis is performed. In the 1990s, legislation prohibited over 550,000 firearms, including military-style firearms and handguns. However, my studies have demonstrated there was no statistically significant benefit on homicide, spousal homicide, or mass homicide rates in Canada. Restrictions of magazine capacity in 1994 was not associated with decreases in homicide or mass homicide rates. Prohibition of full automatic firearms in the late 1970s was also not associated with decreases in homicide or mass homicide rates. Other jurisdictions, such as Australia and England, have also applied significant controls to handguns and semi-automatic rifles, and no statistically significant changes in homicide rates were detected in multiple studies. Studies from the United States examining assault weapon bans have also revealed no significant benefit. Blau et al. And Siegel et al. Found that these legislations were not associated with a decrease in victims. Interestingly, when looking at 30 years of incidents, Blau found that shotguns were more associated with an increase in victims than semi-automatic rifles. Webster et al., using similar quasi-experimental methodology as myself, did not find an association between assault weapon bans and mass homicide incidents or deaths. Public mass homicide incidents or deaths. In summary, the evidence so far demonstrates that the proposed handgun and semi-automatic rifle bans will have no associated reduction in homicide rates or mass homicide rates. Methods that have been shown to be more effective in reducing firearms homicides involves targeting the demand side of the firearms prevalence in criminal activity. As demonstrated by StatsCan, a significant percentage of firearms homicide involves gang violence. To reduce violence that is currently occurring in Canada's cities, the evidence suggests that you need to act early to reduce youth gang involvement. A research report by Public Safety Canada in 2012 gathered evidence from programs operating in Canada to reduce the gang participation rate and demonstrated beneficial effects in the ranges of a 50% reduction in participation. Targeting legal firearms owners who rarely commit crimes with new legislation already shown to have no significant statistical benefit will not change Canada's death rates by firearms. The likely billions of dollars forecasted to be spent on confiscating firearms would be better spent on youth diversion and gang reduction programs. Thank you.
We will start with Ms. Dancho. Ms. Dancho, please go ahead, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here. I have a question for each. Dr. Langmann, first of all, thank you again for both being here. But Dr. Langmann, your resume is quite extensive, and I know you're a very humble person, but I would like to highlight some of it. You have a PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology. You received your MD from Queen's University. You are a specialty emergency medical doctor at McMaster University. You received your specialty of emergency medicine at McMaster. You were also a fellow at the Royal College of Physicians in Canada. You were the chief trauma fellow in 2011. You are currently an ER doctor at St. Joseph's. You are also assistant clinical professor of medicine at McMaster University and the director of clinical teaching unit at St. Joseph's Hospital. I could go on, but that was just some of the highlights. You've also studied a number of peer-reviewed papers, and you are certainly one of the foremost experts in Canada from the research that I've been able to do on the issue of gun violence in terms of homicide, domestic homicide, and mass homicide, and the impact, if any, of various governments' gun control legislation. Is that, as a very in brief, a summary of your qualifications and the research that you do?
Yes.
Okay. I have, and I've reviewed your papers, and it would seem that, just to conclude, as you mentioned in your opening, that the gun control measures brought forward in the last number of years by this government and other governments have had no impact on homicide, domestic homicide, or mass homicide. Can you confirm that?
That's correct.
And again, your research is heavily peer-reviewed, and you've also been asked yourself by various medical journals to review other research papers in a similar field. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so just again, you have found no statistical significant beneficial association between firearms legislation and homicide by firearm, as well as spousal homicide by firearm, and as well as the criminal charge of discharge of firearm with intent. Is that correct?
That's correct. In this country. Canada.
In this country.
Yes.
Thank you. And your conclusions are based on sound statistical analysis, specifically in particular from the Government of Canada. Is that correct?
Yes, I use a lot of the Statistics Canada data. However, my studies have been peer-reviewed. They've also appeared in review articles, including in a recent Canadian Medical Association journal article, and rated the highest evidence that was available for examining this issue.
Very strict evidentiary standard with very high scientific analysis. Understood. And your latest peer-reviewed study went up to include statistical data from up to 2022, including 2022. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I do appreciate you coming very much. I know others will have questions for you as well, but as we all agree, it's important to make evidence-based decisions, so I appreciate you bringing this evidence to the forefront once again at our committee. With my remaining time, Mr. Ryckman, I did want to ask you about the trust factor with hunters, because that's what I'm hearing a lot, that they've seen a number of their commonly used firearms being banned under these two amendments that have temporarily been withdrawn. And we know, and you really were very eloquent in your opening remarks about the hunting culture in Canada. And there's a bit of a debate that goes on, I know, in criticism of the hunting culture about trophy hunting. But I want to share something with you and for you to share with me what you've heard from your 100,000 members. But I grew up hunting with my dad, and there's a record book for your trophy buck. And it's a huge honor to get in there. And my dad hunted for many years. And finally, to the great pride of my family, he got a 165 typical. It was a really big moment for us, and I'll never forget it. I know, pretty impressive, right? Yeah, and I myself, when I was in high school, I got a special award from my local outfitter or hunting association that gave me a plaque. It was a proud moment for my dad for the biggest buck for my age category. So I know that your associations do a lot of that work, encouraging young people, and it's just very natural to, when you're going to hunt, everyone wants the biggest buck or the biggest fish when they're fishing, and it's a very important part of the culture. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And, the concern about trophy hunting is that nowadays, simply the use of the term can be somewhat misleading. We don't really have a huge culture of trophy hunting in Canada by any means, at least not the way that some people tend to interpret that term. Generally, that is restricted to, traveling on African big game safaris, for instance, where the meat is left with the local communities, and the hunter, the person who harvests it, takes part of that home with them, the trophy, if you will. So when it comes to trophy hunting or even trophy fishing here in Ontario and Canada, it's very, very, very different. The trophy fish in my family is my daughter's first fish.
Oh, wow.
And it's a small fish.
I got a master angler carp when I was a young girl, so that was a proud moment too. Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I think it really brings a sense of competition and encouragement, and I know that your association does a lot of that Canadian work, and that there's a huge pride element to that. I did want to, just again, with my concluding minute, can you speak to the trust factor here? Because again, there has to be a lot of trust between the government, who's in charge of the Firearms Act, which is the federal government, and the 100,000 members and subscribers that you have. And I'm very concerned, again, trust in government is very important. We need to be law-abiding citizens, and I am very concerned about this. This is what I'm hearing, but can you speak with the remaining 30 seconds to what you're hearing from your members? Again, that's 100,000 members and subscribers.
Yeah, I mean, from the hunting community at large, we're hearing very much the same thing, in that what a bill that originally started as a handgun ban very quickly and unexpectedly was expanded to include some hunting rifles and shotguns. And that moment alone was enough to, I wouldn't say completely erode trust in the government from the hunting community, but certainly make them pause and say, what exactly are we trying to do here, and what is the government's ultimate goal?
Thank you very much. I believe I'm out of time. And again, thank you both for coming.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Dancho. We go now to Ms. Damoff. Ms. Damoff, please go ahead, 6 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. Obviously, we're here having these additional meetings because we acknowledge that there were organizations like the Hunters and Anglers of Ontario who were not heard on what was in the bill. So I very much appreciate you being here today and offering your testimony and your expertise. It does mean a lot to us to hear the perspective of hunters. It was never our intention to ban the rifles that are commonly used in hunting. So your appearance here is very much appreciated today. I do have a question, though, because there has been a lot of misinformation that has perpetrated into the hunting community that many people feel that the guns they own will now be banned, and in fact, we have to take some responsibility for that because the list was not easy to understand nor interpret. But do you know how many would still be available? How many models would still be available in the Canadian market if G46 had actually been passed?
I don't actually know the number of units or even the number of different models that would still be available. I can certainly say that that is not, the amendment would not ban every single, at least as written now, wouldn't ban every single commonly used rifle or shotgun right now.
No, I had a few people reach out to me, and I checked with Minister Mendicino's office because I myself couldn't interpret the list. And for everyone that I checked, even though they thought it was banned, it was not. My understanding is that there's about 19,000 models that will still be available. But do you know, or have you heard from your members about ones that actually were on the list that you feel should be excluded? I'm just wondering if people contacted you with certain models that they felt that actually was on the list that should be excluded.
Sure. I suppose my response would be in two parts. The direct answer to your query is that the SKS is probably one of the more ubiquitous hunting rifles, and it is clearly on the list. And I think everybody admits that at this point. And that is a rifle that is perfectly legitimate for the purposes of hunting in Canada and in Ontario, and that is on the list. It would be prohibited if G4 and G46 were to had been passed and not withdrawn. The broader concern is that, at some point, if the government has to create a laundry list of exempted guns, it starts to make such question if the legislation was crafted properly in the first place. It's one thing to exempt a single model of firearm or two, but if you start having to, exempt 15, 20, 30, 50 models because the hunting community is concerned about them being prohibited, then perhaps that's more indicative about the wording of the legislation.
Okay, no, thank you. And certainly we have heard about the SKS. I would say, though, that it's been used in 11 shootings of police officers over the last 6 years, most recently here in Ontario, and it was originally designed for the military. I do understand, but there are other models that could be used rather than the SKS. So, I mean, that's it. The intent was to take a look at how these have been used and how they were designed, and that was one that was originally designed for the military. I understand that you have quite a large membership in your organization, and I applaud you for that. There's been a pretty big increase in PAL owners over the last 2 years. Have you seen your membership increase over the last few years as more people have obtained their PAL?
So our membership fluctuates all the time. Sometimes it fluctuates greatly, and there are some nuances about the insurances that we provide to member clubs that actually dictates that sometimes. Some of our member clubs are 4-person hunt camps that have incorporated. Others are, several hundred in size. And, just speaking hypothetically, if we were to lose one of those clubs, that can make a big difference in our membership from month to month. So we certainly haven't seen a linear increase along with the number or the increase in the number of PAL holders in Canada. Obviously the possession and acquisition license is required not just for hunting, for instance, but even for just handgun owners or target shooters or competitors. So you wouldn't necessarily expect every PAL holder to be a hunter necessarily, and certainly not the member of a conservation organization like the OFAH, because they're not necessarily hunters.
We have about 30 seconds left, but I would ask a favor. We could probably, I think everyone would appreciate your organization and those like yours to help disseminate factual information and try to dispel some of the misinformation that did get out there. So we would be very grateful in your assistance in making sure that people are dealing with facts and not misinformation when they're looking at this really important legislation. So thank you for what you're doing and being here.
Thank you, Ms. Damoff. We go now, Madame Michaud. 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci aux témoins pour...
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to witnesses for your presence here. It's most appreciated. I invited the Quebec Association of Hunters to appear today, so we're very happy to hear from the Ontario Association. I'm sure that you have similar positions, but it's still interesting to hear from you. And as I looked at your internet site, I noted that there was a call to action regarding Bill C-21. And you were describing the reasons for your disagreement with the proposed amendments as proposed by the government. Among those reasons, you said that you were concerned with the impact on hunters because several of these firearms are used by hunters across the country. So maybe I'll piggyback on what my colleague Ms. Damoff said. You talked about the SKS, and we've heard a lot about that. You said several weapons. Can you give me examples of weapons which are currently used for hunting, which were on that list? Did your members identify the fact that the weapon that they were using was on the list?
I don't have a list in front of me, unfortunately. I will call back to a report that a colleague of mine authored. It was actually in response to the May 2020 OIC, so it's a little bit further back than the amendments and the new firearm models that are on G46. But we surveyed a large number of hunters across Canada and asked them, of these newly prohibited firearms, which were non-restricted, a day ago, which ones of these, which models are you currently using or were you using for legitimate hunting purposes in Canada? And at that time, we identified, the survey respondents identified, I believe it was about 64 models at that time. Of course, the currency data is a little bit different, and the impact of the amendment and obviously whatever final wording would be imposed or would be adopted would dramatically affect what is actually on that list, right? So the Plinkster, for instance, we can go through model by model. The concern and some of the uncertainty, I will admit, is in the interpretation of some of those proposed amendments. We heard, I listened to hours of standing committee testimony, and the experts from the RCMP and Public Safety Canada and the Canadian Firearms Program and so on and so forth. And they were very forthcoming about what they intended the interpretation of those amendments and those provisions to be. They're not the final arbiters of the legal interpretation of those amendments. The final arbiter is a court of law. So if there is that much confusion in the interpretation of an amendment, then at a bare minimum, it needs to be looked at again, almost certainly reworded, and if it's that bad, it needs to be withdrawn. And that is ultimately what is going to drive the makes and models that are on G46.
Donc, je comprends que vous déplorez la façon dont le gouvernement...
So you deplore the way the government proceeded. It was complicated to understand which model was prohibited and which model wasn't. Well, I'll let you answer. I think the answer is yes.
Merci.
Thank you. We received an explanation, a detailed explanation, which is very brief. At some point in committees, we had officials here, and we asked them to give us a written explanation. And it's actually easy to understand, but we had a lot of trouble understanding it. It seemed unclear, but this was interesting to see that Appendix 1 dealt with weapons which have already been prohibited since 1990, since the 2020 OIC. And then in Appendix 2, they talked about subparagraphs 97 to 232, which referred to weapons which would be prohibited with the additional amendments. We're talking about approximately 480 brands and models of weapons which are currently not prohibited. So that doesn't add that many. I agree with my colleagues that there was all kinds of misinformation circulating, because if you typed Control F into the document and you had a model number, you thought that it was prohibited, and you could talk about a completely different model. or, there was a heading previously that said, except for these models. And so it created a lot of confusion. So to try to clear things up, I'm trying to see what's being done elsewhere. Because sometimes it's a good idea to compare what's being done in other countries and to see how they proceeded. The committee analysts and the library were kind enough to prepare a document for me quickly. And I have the New Zealand example. The way they proceeded is somewhat similar to what the government was proposing with G4 and G46. But there is a line that was of particular interest. It said the bill wishes to preserve access to semi-automatic weapons of lower capacity recognized for being used by hunters and farmers. So we see that in New Zealand they proceeded similarly, but with that attention for farmers and hunters and perhaps even Indigenous peoples using certain models. Now, we understand the government is going to go back to the drawing board and try to come up with something. Do you believe that in this new proposal there should be this kind of attention for hunters and farmers and Indigenous peoples as New Zealand did?
That's an excellent question, and thank you for that detail. I would have to think about that a little bit harder. I will say, though, that going back to the trust concerns that Ms. Dancho echoed, even if something like that were written into this legislation, the government has lost the trust of many people in the hunting community. So those people might not trust the government to actually say, you know what, you've identified this as a legitimate hunting rifle, so as promised, we will not prohibit it. That trust is gone, and it's going to take a long time to rebuild that trust. So while on paper it seems like a very logical compromise, I'm not sure it would go nearly far enough to assuage the concerns of the hunting community.
Thank you. Merci, Madame. We go now to Mr. Julian. Go ahead, please. 6 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much to our witnesses. This is all part of the feedback that we need to get as a committee as we look to next steps after the withdrawal of the amendments. Dr. Langmann, I would like to start with you. You have stated that even with the increase in firearms, it was the rate of homicides, suicides did not change between 2003 and the last year of the study, right?
Yeah, so there's been no overall, so there's a fluctuation that occurs, but statistically there isn't an increase associated with an increase in the rates of firearm ownership.
Okay. Have you been, as part of your study or as part of your work in analyzing other countries, you referenced Australia and England, Madame Michaud has just referenced New Zealand. Have you also done analysis in terms of untraceable or the rise of untraceable ghost guns, firearms that are not we're not able to register or trace them? Has that been part of the study work that you have done?
So all firearm homicides are included in the research. Unfortunately, Statistics Canada doesn't label guns as ghost guns. They'll label them as other at times, sometimes if it's difficult to identify or they just were not identified in the report. So currently there's no real record of specifically ghost gun homicides or ghost guns used in crimes.
Statistics Canada treats ghost guns as kind of a ghost in terms of the statistical follow-up.
It's a new era. It's a new thing that we're starting to see, right? So they're going to have to catch up with their methods, and so will the police services that report these to Statistics Canada.
Now, I mean, anecdotally, in terms of the news, we've in the United States, I understand there's been 1,000% increase in the use of ghost guns. So I understand the statistical problem, given that it's not actually something that is tracked. But by law enforcement on this side of the border as much, or by Statistics Canada. Is this something that is part moving forward that you would like to study or quantify? Because it appears to be an increasing problem, but obviously not something, as you point out, it's something we have to catch up on.
I mean, it's definitely something I would like to look at. Unfortunately, right now, the data doesn't exist.
Okay. You referenced gang violence. I know you've provided recommendations on anti-gang strategies, which has been really important. Do you see a link between the use of ghost guns and gang violence? And though I understand you can't quantify that this is something that should be of increasing concern to all of us who are looking at public safety?
Anecdotally, it is. The rates have increased, and of course, as measures are taken to restrict firearms ownership, there will be a black market that exists, and we're starting to see that. These things being printed. Also, 3D printers are becoming a lot more common across North America as well. So it's one of those things where you're going to start needing to target the demand side of the equation. You're trying to control the supply side right now by banning firearms based on spurious definitions. And really, if you don't start targeting the demand side, you're not going to see any benefit. You're targeting usually legal gun owners who are going to comply with the regulations. They're the least most likely to be involved in criminal activity in this country. They've already gone through screening. And so it's no wonder that when I look at these legislations, I don't see any benefit, because you wouldn't expect to get any marginal benefit on a group that is already such a low risk. That's probably where you should start directing your work, is towards the demand side.
Yeah. So, given that, you have recommendations that you would make to this committee on the demand side, and specifically understanding the difficulty in quantifying the extent of the ghost gun problem. How, as a committee, we should be looking at that issue as well.
Well, the difficulty is, for a lot of criminals, they just need the gun for one purpose at one time, and then they can throw it away. And so even a printed polycarbonate barrel, one use, and then it's done. So the recommendations I would give you would be to start targeting youth at risk, very early at risk, so that are starting to get involved in criminal activity, and start youth diversion programs, diverting them away from that activity. Cognitive behavioral therapy, starting to work on the significant methamphetamine problem that we're seeing in all our communities across this country. Currently, my emergency department right now behind me is full of patients that are intoxicated or suffering from psychosis from methamphetamine abuse. I think that really this focus on a small segment of society that uses firearms for generally a legitimate purpose is maybe diverting your attention from a significant need right now, which is to start looking at diversion right away and funding those areas. There was, like I said, a 2012 report by
Thank you, Doctor. I'm going to have to cut you off there.
No problem.
Thank you, Mr. Julian. We'll start our second round now with Mr. Lloyd. Mr. Lloyd, please go ahead, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The whole premise of why we're here today is because it was believed, a group put forward the argument that we needed an evergreen definition of what an assault-style weapon would be, because the argument was made that gun manufacturing companies are attempting to circumvent Canadian laws by introducing new models into Canada that are not covered by our existing laws. Mr. Ryckman, you are well-versed in firearms. Is there any evidence that that gun manufacturing companies are attempting to do this, as has been claimed?
Yeah, unfortunately, I probably can't speak intelligently on behalf of the gun manufacturers, although I will say that generally speaking, any business responds to the market. Generally speaking, the concern that we have with the evergreen definition in general. Our position is that any attempt to adopt an evergreen definition of a prohibited firearm, expanded in such a way that it tackles or includes semi-automatic centerfire rifles and shotguns, will impact the hunting community. Plain and simple.
Thank you for that. To rephrase sort of, I mean, as a hunter myself and hunters that I know, the firearms that we use have been firearms that have been used in this country for decades and decades. Would you say that the vast majority of firearms used by hunters that you represent are models and makes of firearms that have been used for a very long time in this country?
Certainly, currently, yes, that would be the case. Yep.
So is there evidence that, are you seeing new models of firearms coming out for the purpose of circumventing Canadian laws, and are people using these firearms for hunting?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have an answer to that question, Mr.
Okay.
Lloyd. Sorry.
Now, Dr. Langmann, sort of similar question. Are you seeing evidence that it's new models of firearms being manufactured by firearms companies for the purpose of circumventing Canadian law? Are these being used in crimes? Is this something that is truly an issue?
Well, the criminals will use any firearm they can obtain. There's not a firearm specifically they're looking for, mostly handguns, but they will use whatever they can get. The SKS as was brought up earlier. It's a firearm that's been around since the 1940s, and it's commonly used. It was very cheap and sold broadly in this country after the collapse of the Soviet bloc. So we've seen a lot of those being used because they're widely available, but it's just due to a commonality reason. So something that is common is used. All types of firearms are extremely dangerous. So the bolt-action rifle, what we're calling hunting rifles, those have been used to kill police officers. Those have been used to kill patients that I've seen. They're extremely dangerous. They're more dangerous, I think, than what's commonly called an assault rifle, because the caliber and the energy from the projectile is a lot higher than most, quote, assault rifles like the AR-15.
Another interesting
to me,
thing
as a physician,
that was another interesting.
It doesn't make sense.
Some previous witnesses made the distinction between military calibers and hunting calibers. Mr. Ryckman, is there such a distinction? Are there truly such things called military calibers and things that are hunting calibers?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that most people are talking about military firearms more than anything. I mean, there is so much overlap, not just in caliber, as you mentioned, between military firearms, true military firearms, and the civilian versions that evolve from some of those military firearms.
NATO standard is a 7.62 millimeter caliber round.
Right.
Is that smaller than what most hunters would actually use for hunting?
Yeah, unfortunately, the variation, even within Ontario, even within the Ontario deer hunting population, there is significant variation in preference for caliber and type of firearm and so on and so forth. So I don't think I can speak accurately about the variation across Canada, but I imagine it's significant. So the choice of a firearm, the choice that a hunter...
calibers that are larger than what the military uses.
Yes.
So by classifying military calibers as large calibers, we're actually capturing more hunting calibers than we're actually capturing calibers of cartridges that are actually used by the military.
Yeah, quite possible, yes. Yep.
Okay. I was reading a really interesting... Sorry?
15 seconds.
Well, Statistics Canada came out with very interesting back in December 2021 firearm violence. 0.47% of violent crimes had a rifle or a shotgun present. 0.47% present. Not necessarily used, but present. So we're talking about a very small amount. Out of that, a significant amount of those were gang-related. So when we're talking about legal firearm owners and the legislation that we're bringing forward here today, we are talking about a fraction of 0.5% of total violent crimes in this country. And we're missing the whole boat on 99% of crimes in this country. Thank you.
Do you need a quick answer for that?
I would like to answer. It probably won't be quick, though.
Well, do what you can, and I'll cut you off if you go too long.
Sure. Yeah, you're absolutely right in that. Ultimately, we need to be helping the people that need help. We need to take guns away, whatever guns they are, from people who shouldn't have them, plain and simple. We need to ensure that our enforcement bodies have the funding, the training, and the tools that they need to deal with things like organized crime and gun violence. That includes the upstream determinants of involvement in crime and so on and so forth. So we ultimately, and finally, I should say, not ultimately, but we also need to ensure that the justice system treats violent crime, including gun crime, with the severity that it deserves.
Sir.
Thank you.
We go now to Dr. Hanley. Doctor, please go ahead. 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for the chance to appear before this committee. I'm speaking to you from the Yukon, and I want to thank the committee members all around the table for the tremendous work that you've done on this bill. So consider me as somewhat of a newbie to the committee, but nevertheless, a couple of maybe a minute and a half or so with Dr. Langmann. Thank you for your work, and I think you have a long history of careful work on this. I just wanted to know what your confidence is in the data, because I've also heard that there's actually a lack of data. We really don't have enough data to be able to correlate the association between particular firearms and whether legal or illegally acquired, for example, and incidents. And I'm also worried about the perception that what we've achieved so far with gun control as one aspect of prevention of gun violence, that maybe we've gone too far. So I just want to know how confident you are in the amount of data we have, and if you believe that we should have more data to be able to really understand what's going on.
So you're asking someone who's a statistician if they'd like more data, and the answer is yes. We always like more data. The good thing is that actually there are a very low number of mass homicides in this country, and so that alone speaks to something. Partly it's a population issue. But however, I do, in terms of analyzing the data, sensitivity tests, it's called, to see how good is the data at predicting something. And the answer is it's actually fairly good at predicting whether, say, for instance, a certain legislation has had any beneficial effect. So in terms of homicide and spousal homicide and mass homicide, suicide, et cetera, I can say that. I would love to have, of course, data regarding where the guns were obtained, how specifically they were used, as well as the background of the perpetrator in terms of whether they have criminal background, whether this was used in a familicide, those sorts of things. Unfortunately, a lot of that data is also private and protected, so Statistics Canada has certain controls in terms of keeping that information. But that would be something for the government to, of course, mandate and work on.
Thank you. We'd love to have you elaborate on that, but I want to move on. But I do want to just point out the CMA policy statement on gun violence, where they point out through international review that civilian access to firearms with rapid fire capability does result or appears to result in an increased incidence of mass shootings. So it's really to point out that the overall correlation between poor control availability of firearms and mass shootings, which is, I know, one of the intents of this bill C-21. But I want to quickly turn back to Dr. Ryckman. And Dr. Ryckman, you've written quite eloquently. I've read some of what you've written on your website about trying to find common ground. So maybe in an attempt to find some common ground here, I haven't, despite I'm sure you're aware of many of the concerns expressed from my constituents in the Yukon, but I haven't yet met anyone in the Yukon who does not deplore gun violence. And I also want to commend what I just heard from the testimony of the witness from Polysesouvient in the previous hour, a powerful testament to the value of hunting. So I see that there is possibility to converge on some common ground. Do you see that? Do you see gun violence in Canada as an urban issue, a rural issue, or both, or neither?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'll admit I'm not an expert on gun violence. I will say I think you'd be hard pressed to find any Canadians that don't think the government can do more to reduce gun violence, even though we are not America by any stretch of the imagination, despite the onslaught of American media stories that we get every day. Canada does have very robust gun laws, a very robust legislative framework that dictates the use and ownership of guns. So we are not America in that regard, and there's always more that the government can do. The question becomes, what is the threshold? What is the goal of the policy that the government is trying to do? In this case, started out as a handgun ban, and as I said earlier, unexpectedly morphed and evolved into something that was a direct impact on the hunting community. So while I agree with you, gun violence is an issue, I think everybody would agree with you as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. On y va maintenant à Madame Michaud.
And now over to Madame Michaud. 2.5 minutes, please. Thank you, Chair. I'll continue with you, Mr. Ryckman. You are probably aware of the fact that after the amendments were tabled by the government, all members of all parties received hundreds and hundreds of calls, emails, etc., from people who were angry, who didn't understand. And we all heard about it in our official dinners and our ridings, but also at family suppers, dinners with friends. Everyone had an opinion, and that's fine. I wasn't surprised, but perhaps, well, maybe surprised to note that sometimes when I would talk to hunters, their response was, well, if my hunting weapon is going to be prohibited, I'll buy another one. Now, we understand that that wasn't the reaction of every hunter, and that's fine, and it's to be expected that they could be heard. But my understanding is that the government did not consult hunters before introducing these amendments, so that's totally legitimate to hear from them. But do you believe that this may have fed their attitude, the fact that they felt that hunters didn't know what the next steps would be? For example, if the bill were to go through with these amendments in which perhaps there are weapons currently being used for hunting, the fact that hunters didn't know what would happen the day after the bill would go through. Would they be arrested by the police because they have a prohibited object? Or would there be a buyback program? Would they be able to sell their weapon back to the government? Was the police going to burst into their house to get their weapon? There was no answers to give at the time when the amendments were initially tabled. Do you think that this really increased the upset that hunters were legitimately feeling?
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's been mentioned a couple times already in that there was, not only was there some disinformation, there was some misinformation, there was simply a lack of clarity, and the responsibility for that lies mostly on the government for the way it was introduced. You're absolutely right in that the OFAH did not provide comment on Bill C-21 originally, and even if we had, we would not have been speaking about the amendments because they didn't exist at the time. So we would have been speaking about the content of the bill in front of us, which is entirely different than what we're talking about today or what I'm here to talk about today. So uncertainty is absolutely a driver of concern. Not just uncertainty about how to interpret some of those provisions that were being proposed, uncertainty about whether or not the RCMP was going to be knocking on somebody's door and taking their gun, whether or not they were going to be properly compensated for property that they legally owned the day before. So you're absolutely correct, and I would agree that confusion drives some of that concern, absolutely. And we made a concerted effort to get as much information from public safety and the government as possible and put that out there. And I will say, before I finish, that you're welcome for all those emails. We did not create this issue. We did not create the anger and the distrust in the hunting community. The process did, and the content of the amendments did. We simply gave people a very straightforward and easy way to contact their members of parliament.
Merci, Madame. Mr. Julian, please go ahead. 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to go to you, Mr. Ryckman, just so I understand where your organization was prior to the amendments being tabled. What was the position of your organization on C-21?
Great question. Without going into a huge summary of our submission, I'll leave it at there were some concerns about C-21, some impacts on people having their firearms taken away through the red and yellow flag laws, for instance, without a proper hearing or without notice. Not necessarily anything that could be assuaged through amendments, for instance. I will also say, though, that the amendments that we're here to talk about today, or that I'm here to talk about today, are clearly an impact on the hunting community, and that is our mandate to promote hunting. Part of our mandate is to promote hunting in Ontario and do what we can to protect that heritage. A lot of the content of Bill C-21 itself lies outside of our charitable mandate. So while we may have some concerns, there isn't a whole lot of lobbying that we necessarily do on some of those provisions.
Okay.
Yeah. So
the amendments certainly changed that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned, and I may have misunderstood, so please correct me if I'm wrong. You said that you had done a survey and there were 64 models that members of the organization had indicated were impacted by the amendments?
Sorry, just to be clear, I was going back a little bit in time to say that survey was conducted in response to the May 2020 Ordering Council, which banned a bunch of firearms. So if we were to conduct a similar survey today, or let's say a month after those amendments would have passed, for instance, the answer would have been much different because the list of firearms is much different than it was as a result of the OIC.
Okay, well, let's come back to the 64 models then with the OIC. Can you extrapolate, or do you have an idea of how many of your 100,000 members would have been impacted? There's the model side, and then there's the actual numbers of the people that have those models.
Yeah, that's a great question. Those details I don't have off the top of my head. I do have a copy of the report. It's fairly extensive that I could provide to the clerk if there's interest in me doing so. Again, I would just add the caveat that was in response to the May 2020 OIC, and the responses would be different, as a result of the amendments.
Yeah, I think would give us a better idea of the impacts, right? Yeah.
That's 3 seconds, so that's good. We'll go now to Ms.
As if I was, my time was up on my side, I thought, so.
Well, I appreciate the 3 seconds back, right? Mr. Mott, we'll go with you, 4 minutes, followed by Mr. Chiang with 4 minutes. We'll cut it back a little bit.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll go to Dr. Langmann. Doctor, the government tries to convince Canadian and the Canadian public that they employ evidence-based decision-making, but based on your testimony and extensive, credible, non-government funded research, there is no evidence to support that firearm prohibitions have any impact on public safety, homicides, or suicides. So it seems to me the government is rather involved in decision-based evidence-making. So I think the committee really has to ask itself, would we rather have less firearms, as they're proposing in our community, or would we rather have less criminals committing crimes with illegal firearms? And I mean, I will say that it seems to me that the lazy approach is to just outlaw firearms, as they're trying to do. But your research, in your research, this would have a corresponding effect, you say, in nothing to do with ending gun violence, ending homicides, mass homicides, suicides, domestic violence. In the time that's left, can you please explain your thoughts on that, please?
Sure. I mean, the current proposals even confuse me because they're talking about assault weapons, and in terms of research, it's really hard to know what even that means. Because in my mind, they're probably talking about semi-automatic rifles. And so if you look at all the research, both that I've done and in other countries, actually, so Australia did ban majority of these, as well as Great Britain. And there's no evidence that it's reduced the homicide rates there. The fact is that people can still use other types of firearms, so bolt-action rifles. Derek Bird in 2010 drove around Great Britain with a shotgun and a bolt-action rifle and killed 12 people. So it's possible to commit these acts with any type of gun. What the legislation seems to do is it targets the sort of legal gun owners, and it doesn't seem to target. It did in terms of some of the mandatory minimums, but for the most part, it seems to target legal firearms owners with a variety of legislation and restrictions. And you're targeting a group of people that are rarely involved in criminal behavior. And so it would seem to me that your best target would be trying to reduce demand in the criminal area, trying to reduce the movement of young, usually male youths into gang behavior, and trying to deal with some of the proliferation of street drugs that have occurred in this country. We're at a dangerous level in terms of methamphetamines now. This is what I see in the emergency department all the time. And all I hear is we're targeting a bunch of hunters. It doesn't make any sense to me. It seems like we have our blinders on almost to what's going on around us. And I could go on, but I think that's...
Please do. I have a minute left. The floor is yours.
Very well. I mean, just to go back to this assault weapon, it's no wonder to me that we have this strange list, and we have some guns in it, some not, and it doesn't seem to make sense to anybody, and it doesn't make sense to me as a researcher, because to me it would be based on the action of the actual rifle. So is it a semi-automatic rifle? Is it a bolt action rifle that we're concerned with? And then are we concerned with the fact that most hunting rifles actually use high caliber, high velocity, high energy projectiles that can cause serious damage, and yet we're talking about those as if they're not a concern, and yet these sort of assault rifles like an AR-15 that uses a small caliber is somehow our big concern. You need a better definition if you're going to do anything, and if your definition is does semi-automatic rifle bans result in reduction in homicide, the answer is no. No, there's no good research that shows that from the United States, from Australia, from this country. So choose something else.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Mr. Motz. We go now to Mr. Chiang. Mr. Chiang, go ahead, please. 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I cede my time to the committee, so if you like, we can adjourn the meeting.
Very well. Thank you all for your time here today, and thank you to the witnesses. It's been most helpful. Your expertise and experience will help us a lot. So thank you all. And with that, we are now adjourned.